In our last lecture, we were wielding Nietzsche's hammer. We were tapping and we were smashing, and we left a lot of rubble on the ground. Before we go on to replace our hammer with maybe a sculptor's chisel and mallet, or a paintbrush, or even a pen, it's worth examining some of the rubble that we've created. I think that's important because Nietzsche's beautiful oratorical prose and all of his calls to conscience, his poetry and his irony can sometimes blind us to how deep and disturbing some of the critiques are that we actually developed last time. And it's worth emphasizing how deep that critique goes. The idols that we were smashing, what Nietzsche calls idols, were in fact values that, as we emphasized when we were talking about modernity, are values that are central to a great deal of our own lives. These are the values of modernity that undergird much of our contemporary intellectual culture, but also our political culture. Nietzsche was concerned to criticize the idea of progress, the idea that in each generation we advance over previous generations, that philosophical thought, scientific thought, political thought takes us from more primitive to more progressive states. Nietzsche was concerned to reject the idea that reason is the foundation of our knowledge, and that science and rational activity should be at the base of our public discourse. That's another view that we tend to take very seriously in our own culture. Nietzsche rejected systematicity, the idea that we can have systematic philosophical frameworks and theories to guide our lives, including systematic political frameworks and theories, like those involved, say, in constitutional law, but also including systematic theories of knowledge, systematic theories of morality, and so forth. Nietzsche also argued powerfully against faith in the existence of God and against any role for religion. And this is really important. We saw in Hume and Kant and Mill a critique of the idea that religion should play some role in public life, but very much a commitment to retaining a robust private sphere. We might say the privacy of our own homes or our own churches or synagogues, in which a religious faith was a matter of choice and a matter that ought to be protected and indeed respected. Kant talked about circumscribing reason to make room for faith. Hume talked about the reasonableness of faith even if there's no reason. Mill talked about the importance of protecting a plurality of religious views and religious faiths. Nietzsche will have none of that. Nietzsche argues that even to engage in private in religious faith is an act of bad faith, an act of abandonment of our own authenticity. And finally, and maybe most radically, the last idol that we saw Nietzsche attacking was the idea that values are transcendent at all. Almost every philosopher whose work we've examined in this course, almost every idea we've taken seriously, has been one in which there's some level of transcendent value to which we ought to orient our lives, either an entire cosmos that transcends our experience, or a divinity, or rationality itself. Nietzsche argues against all of that these grand, systematizing, transcendent values take us away from the lives that we lead, take us away from concreteness, and in the end are inauthentic and life-denying. I want to emphasize that because this has been one of the most radical texts we've read so far. If you understand what Nietzsche's up to, you should be challenged by it, but you should also be disturbed by it. Some challenges are disturbing. There's nothing wrong with that. Disturbance is often what makes growth possible. But now it's time to put our hammers down for a while and move towards crafting an account of Nietzsche's positive postmodern conception of what a meaningful life looks like. I'm going to be focusing on a chapter in Twilight that we haven't looked at yet, which Nietzsche calls Expeditions of an Untimely Man. Nietzsche was nothing if not self-confident. So he was talking about his own intellectual expeditions and thought of himself as untimely, precisely in the sense of way before his time. But we're going to first pick up where we left up last time with Nietzsche's discussion of what's problematic about the denial of life. And I want to emphasize a section that Nietzsche calls How the Real World Became a Myth, because this is Nietzsche's final diagnosis of how it is that we find ourselves on an inauthentic flight from reality and an abandonment of responsibility for our own lives. Nietzsche really thinks that the whole phenomenon of modernity, which he sees as a kind of phenomenon of progressive abandonment of responsibility for individual life and a progressive abandonment of authenticity, requires a diagnosis. How is it that living human organisms develop this life-denying urge to abstraction that he thinks flowers in modernity? He gives a 6-step analysis of this process. And on this 6-step analysis, Nietzsche leads us from a position where we start with a basic truth and slowly bend it into dangerous falsehood. Finally, he thinks into incoherence, and at the end into nihilism. I think this is important. Some people interpret Nietzsche as being a nihilist because he attacks so many of the fundamental values that we take seriously. And if you think that these values are the obvious values, the ones that we have to take seriously, when Nietzsche abandons those, you think nothing is left, just the broken rubble. Nietzsche is far from a nihilist. Nietzsche urges an important kind of creativity. But Nietzsche actually thinks that modernity is deeply nihilistic. That's the irony. Nietzsche is actually a critic of nihilism, not a nihilist himself. So what are those 6 steps? Nietzsche begins by saying, we first notice, looking around us, that reality is immanent, that we live in reality, that it's a physical, mental, sensual world that we inhabit. And he says, we then notice that wise people dwell directly in it. They don't abstract from it. They live in it spontaneously, effortlessly, and in this way that we admire. And we see some of that, for instance, in Taoism and in Zen, this emphasis on how wise people or sages dwell directly in presence in reality, understanding its concreteness, impermanence, and beauty. That's the first step. Nothing wrong with that. But the second step is where the twist begins. Nietzsche says, we then say to ourselves, these wise people really dwell in reality. So the real world, the way reality is known and inhabited only by the wise. That it's only if you're really wise that you really understand reality. The rest of us are somehow misguided and we dwell in an illusion. Now this is a very subtle twist, right? All it does is go from wise people dwell in reality to only wise people really dwell in reality. And that gives us the idea that unwise people, me, dwell in some kind of a cosmic illusion. Once we make that twist, though, we've disenfranchised ourselves. I've now said my life isn't real, and that's only the beginning. But that's the beginning of alienating myself from my own existence, from this kind of inauthenticity or a fall from conscience. What's the third step? In the third step, we say, okay, you've got to be really wise to dwell in the real world. So the real world is practically unattainable. There's no way that somebody like me could ever understand reality. But I can at least posit that as a goal or an ideal. And Nietzsche sees that as what animates Christianity. The idea that we're born in sin, we're born in confusion, but there's at least an ideal possibility that we, like Christ, could attain a certain sense of reality. Next step. We notice that that goal is so ideal, so distant, that we say, in fact, the real world is completely unknowable. It's unconceptualizable. It's beyond our understanding. Still, somehow it's an ideal, but you'd have to be really transcendent to get it. Nietzsche thinks that that's what we see in some forms of Buddhism, for instance. And he's right. We also see an echo of that in the book of Job, that reality, the universe, God, totally unconceptualizable. But still, somehow, it's there in the picture. Then Nietzsche says, once we've desiccated it so far that it's completely unknowable, we then say to ourselves, there really is no real world. It's so remote that it's basically non-existent. All there is appearance. And the only rational attitude, you might say, once we've gone so far as to make reality in principle unknowable, is to just do away with it and say we just live in a world of appearance completely. And we've seen again that a Zen analysis of ordinary experience where we in fact are perceiving, but we experience the world through a conception that is a pure haze of illusion, is a nice example of how that works. And finally, Nietzsche says that's the end of the story. Because if there's no reality, only appearance, then even the appearance can't be real. And then we've fallen into total nihilism where nothing is real at all. And when we do that, we have abandoned any commitment to our own lives as real, let alone meaningful. So here Nietzsche sets out a beautiful garden path to nihilism on how you give up on life. And he sets it out because he thinks it's very enticing. Each step leads naturally to the next. And he thinks it's very dangerous. On this garden path, we begin by drawing the contrast between appearance and reality. That's harmless enough, it seems. And we valorize reality. And by valorizing reality and making it more and more unreachable, we end up deprecating our own existence. What's the alternative for Nietzsche? That's where we're going now. The alternative is to affirm our lives, to make beauty and meaning out of our actual lives, not somewhere else in some idealization, according to some artificial framework. So now let's look at Nietzsche's discussion of his own conception of freedom. We'll see that when Nietzsche talks about freedom and Nietzsche talks about progress, he offers a completely alternative vision to that we saw in modernism. Nietzsche sees modernity as degenerate, as being the end result of this horrible garden path we just sketched. And he sees modernism as requiring a total inversion of values, not a rejection of all values, but what Nietzsche calls elsewhere a revaluation of values, taking what modernity sees as most important and seeing it as the mistake, and taking what modernity deprecates and seeing that as what's important. Let's examine Nietzsche's conception of freedom. The value of a thing sometimes lies not in what one attains with it, but in what one pays for it. I give an example. And of course, this example will not be randomly chosen. Nietzsche is really aiming for the heart here. He says, liberal institutions, and he really means liberal institutions, liberal democracy, the kind of civilization and society that we now inhabit, say, in the United States, but with which he was familiar in Europe. Liberal institutions immediately cease to be liberal as soon as they are attained. Subsequently, there is nothing more thoroughly harmful to freedom than liberal institutions. I want to repeat that. This is a deep idea, and we're going to explore why Nietzsche believes this in a moment. There is nothing more thoroughly harmful to freedom than liberal institutions. One knows indeed, he says, what they bring about. They undermine the will to power. They are the leveling of mountain and valley exalted to a moral principle. Notice what he's doing now. He's criticizing the very heart of the values of liberal democracy, the ideas of equality and of liberty for all. They are the leveling of mountain and valley exalted to a moral principle. In plain words, and here's Nietzsche's deep critique, we're going to explore this in a moment, reduction to the herd animal. Nietzsche is going to argue that liberal institutions reduce us to the level of, say, sheep. He continues, for what is freedom? That one has the will to self-responsibility. Let's examine this very challenging passage. Here, Nietzsche isn't rejecting the notion of freedom altogether, and some people have suggested that he does that. That's not true. Nietzsche is instead rejecting the very idea of freedom that we find in liberal democracy, the idea of freedom that we saw developed explicitly in Kant and Mill just a few lectures ago. Because those ideas of freedom, Nietzsche thinks, are shallow. They end up being the freedom to act like everybody else, the freedom to be normal, the freedom to lead a life like Ivan Ilyitch. What's more, Nietzsche thinks, that kind of freedom isn't just the freedom to lead that life if one chooses. Rather, once we establish liberal democracy, he said it ceases to be liberal the moment it's established. Why is that? Because it establishes an overarching ideology, a way that we should behave. We should respond to the census. We should vote. We should think about ourselves in terms of Democrats and Republicans. We should take our institutions seriously. We should pledge allegiance to the flag. We should do all of these things that everybody else does. When we do that, Nietzsche says that's where we get the leveling of mountain and valley. We get a single overarching ideology that becomes a dominant ideology that frames all of our thinking and kills creativity. It would be as though we imagined an artistic community that said to itself, now we're going to adopt Cubism, because Cubism liberates us from traditional figurative drawing. Everybody from now on will be Cubist. Would that be a creative, progressive, artistic community? Absolutely not. It might have been freed from something, but it's freed from that into a kind of oppressive uniformity that makes all genuine creativity and authenticity in art impossible. That's what Nietzsche thinks happens in liberal democracy. We replace one pernicious ideology, the ideology of monarchy or paternalism, or the ideology of communitarianism, with a new ideology, the ideology of Kantian or Millian liberal democracy. That just imposes a different level of conformity. And for that reason, the freedom to be Ivan Ilyich is not just the freedom to be Ivan Ilyich, it's a condemnation to the life of Ivan Ilyich. And that's what Nietzsche thinks is terrible about democracy. It makes each life most ordinary, and therefore, in Tolstoy's words, most terrible. Nietzsche's conception of freedom is different. It's a freedom from conformity. It's a freedom to create. It's a freedom that's born in strength, not in liberty. So it's a freedom that is a freedom to rise above the herd, not to be an equal member of the herd. This is profoundly anti-democratic, and we have to recognize that. There is no way to be comfortable harmonizing Nietzsche's own conception of freedom with that, say, that underlies American liberal democracy. Nietzsche sees democracy not as a great achievement, as, say, Kant and Mill did, but as a terrible disaster for humanity, because it treats us all as equal. It levels our lives. It makes our lives easy as well. And Nietzsche thinks that's a problem. The leveling is a problem because the truly great individual, the individual who has the capacity to create an exciting life, and that may well be each of us, by the way. They don't have to be exceptional people. The person who can move out ahead, who can authentically create a life, is prevented from doing so. Prevented from doing so because of the subtle imposition of a uniform ideology, a uniform set of tastes, a uniform view about what a good life looks like, this kind of hegemony of ideology. But secondly, Nietzsche thinks that truly great art arises from struggle, arises from adversity, arises from having to overcome challenges. And liberal democracy is also welfare democracy. Liberal democracy makes our lives easy for us. By making our lives easy, by allowing us to have malls in which to shop and cinemas in which to go see movies and Netflix and Amazon to order things from and so forth. By making our lives easy, it eliminates the conditions that inspire true greatness. Nietzsche values the need to struggle a little bit. So Nietzsche is arguing that a meaningful life is a life of striving and of struggle. It's a life of self-expression. It's a life lived in art where we really set ourselves aside as individuals. It's a life of real individuality, not a life of comfort. It's not that quiet, middle-class life that Ivan Ilyich so enjoyed. So if we're thinking about what kind of freedom Nietzsche is advocating, what his conception of freedom is, and why in some sense it's so far from that of our own culture, we can think of this as the freedom of Arjuna, right? The freedom to fight, the freedom to realize himself, the freedom to be who he is supposed to be, not the freedom of Mill. That is this kind of abstract liberty that gives us a kind of marketplace of ideas in which we can shop and browse as though we're kind of browsing in a department store, with a lot of freedom to choose this, to choose that, to choose this, to choose that, when they're all basically packaged for us in advance. This is the freedom to create art. It's the freedom that we have when we roll up our sleeves and enter the studio, not when we pick up our shopping bags and enter the supermarket. We should note, though, there is one really important place in which we can see Nietzsche as sharing a view with Mill, and is deriving his own views from Mill, even though I'm sure Nietzsche would never approve of this. Mill really worried, in a way that, say, Kant didn't, about the problem of the tyranny of the majority, about the possibility of social expectations and social tastes exerting, as Mill said, a more insidious and powerful tyranny than any tyranny of a single tyrant. Nietzsche shares that, but he thinks Mill has done nothing to eliminate that, only constructed a kind of supermajority of an ideology that worries about the tyranny of the majority. So much for freedom. Let's worry now about progress. Once again, we saw that while it might appear that Nietzsche is against freedom, he's not. He has a different sense of freedom than that we see in liberal democracy. Similarly, we saw Nietzsche tap the idol of philosophical progress and smash it. And you might think that Nietzsche rejects progress in all senses, but he doesn't. He has a sense of progress, and he talks about it in a beautiful passage called Progress in My Sense. Here's what Nietzsche says. I speak of a return to nature, although it is not really a going back, but a going up into a high, free, even frightful nature and naturalness, such as plays with great tasks and is permitted to play with them. The doctrine of equality, but there exists no more poisonous poison, for it seems to be preached by justice itself, while it is the end of justice. This is a very, very challenging remark. Nietzsche is actually trying to develop an internal critique of this ideal of equality that he thinks animates liberal democracy. Nietzsche sees most of modern civilization, and especially liberal democracy, as we've seen, as degenerate forces. Forces that level us and keep us down instead of forces that liberate us. What they do that's so terrible is they take people away from nature, from our natural lives, from the lives that we would ordinarily lead, and take us into these abstractions, to these abstract ideas that drain content out of our existence. More importantly, they encourage a kind of complacency in us, a herd mentality. We see each of us as equal to everybody else in all respects. And in doing that, Nietzsche thinks, they actually discourage real creativity, real art, and real courage. Remember when Nietzsche says that justice, that equality seems to be justice, but it's the reverse. Here's the point. When we preach equality of all people, equal rights, equal justice, and so forth, we say everybody is exactly the same and should be treated in exactly the same way, in some sense or other. Nietzsche's point, though, is very different. He says, in fact, we are all very different from one another. We have different capacities, different desires, different abilities, and different potentials. So another sense of justice, a better sense of justice, Nietzsche thinks, is to give to each person the opportunities that he or she is willing and able to take advantage of. And justice then involves giving to each what is due to them rather than giving to each exactly the same. I mean, think about it in terms of cutting up a pie. You might say if you've got 6 people, the appropriate thing to do is to cut the pie into 6 pieces. That's the liberal democratic approach, Nietzsche would think. The other one would be to say, aha, this person is, a very large athlete who needs a lot of nutrition. This is a very small child. He gets a big piece, she gets a very small piece, giving each person that of which she can take advantage. That's what Nietzsche thinks real justice would be. And he thinks that liberal democracy is antithetical to that in its leveling tendency. So Nietzsche looks more like a very militant Lao-Tzu than he does like anybody modern. Somebody urging this return to this high, wild, dangerous nature. But notice that he does valorize a certain kind of freedom. It's this freedom to create, to make of oneself what one will. And he very much shares Mill's concern that what society ought to be doing is fostering creativity and individuality. That's shared ground. It's just that Nietzsche disagrees dramatically with Mill about what it would take to do that. Mill thinks put a lot of stuff on offer and treat everybody equally. Nietzsche says, don't put stuff on offer. Encourage people to create stuff and make the opportunities for the people who can take advantage of that. Nietzsche is no Democrat. He is an elitist. Take that seriously. But his elitism is a challenge to each of us. He's challenging us to say, what's wrong with that? Why don't I embrace this? And in my own life, Don't I at least want to think of myself as elite? Don't I at least want to take myself as seriously as Nietzsche challenges me to take myself? That's a very interesting challenge. So in a number of senses, we see that Nietzsche is distinctively postmodern. We've seen that he rejects this kind of pre-given unity of the subject, that I sort of come out as an individual and encounter the world, in favor of a self-creative individual. My task for Nietzsche is not just to lead the life that I'm destined to lead. It's to create my own destiny, to write my own story, and then to act it out. Similarly, Nietzsche rejects the idea of the unity and the systematic nature of knowledge, something that we saw undergirded Hume's, Kant's, Mill's vision of what reality and knowledge looks like. In favor, for Nietzsche, of a recognition that there are multiple kinds of knowledge, and none of them is preeminent, and many of them are intuitive, aesthetic, and physical. Because he does that, he rejects the idea of the sovereignty of reason. That's something that we've seen in the Western tradition right since Aristotle. The idea that what makes us distinctively human and what makes our lives meaningful is our ability to reason. We saw that not only in Aristotle, but of course we saw that in the Stoics. We see it in Kant. Hume, of course, distrusted reason in the same sense that Nietzsche did. And Nietzsche is reading Hume a little bit. There's a bit of influence there. But this vein that runs through the West of the sovereignty of reason, Nietzsche thinks is crazy. In favor, he says, we should trust the body. We should trust our senses. Nietzsche rejects the classical idea of progress, the idea that philosophical thought, political thought, and in general, human history is a steady march from the primitive to the better and the better and the better. In fact, he sees us as having been on this terrible decline where we hit the real abyss in modernity where other people see the peak. We hit the abyss because it's the most life-denying, the most leveling, the most self-alienating approach to life that's possible. He sees instead the need to return to our nature and to return to an embrace of nature and to really embrace many, many approaches to action, the possibility of creativity at every moment. As part of that move, Nietzsche rejects the idea of a systematic unity of knowledge. He thinks that human life and human knowledge is messy. Systematizing is always dangerous, always distorting. Intuitive, spontaneous action is what's required, not careful, deliberate, systematic theory. Here we see Nietzsche, as I said earlier, more in tune with Taoism. And finally, he rejects the kind of personal freedom and this kind of open public sphere as a domain of liberty that we see in liberal democracy, rejecting that in favor of thinking about freedom as a very important value, a central human value, but thinking of freedom as individual strength and the possibility of creativity. So then what does Nietzsche think the meaning of life is? A meaningful life for Nietzsche is a life of integrity, a life of authenticity, a life where we create our own goals, our own values, and we live up to them, that we don't abandon our values or abdicate responsibility for our lives to someone else, even to a theory that we endorse. That requires intellectual integrity, it requires moral integrity, it requires aesthetic integrity, and it requires a taking responsibility for our own deepest values. And it requires that we pay attention to what's real, to the actual world around us, not some airy set of abstractions, to our biological nature, not to some ideal of ourselves as free rational beings, and it involves the rejection of everything artificial. Morally, that means we take responsibility for our own actions and autonomy and don't deny them. It means that we need to cultivate our strength, our abilities, and our talents, that our task in life is to make ourselves the heroes of really great autobiographies. And at bottom, we can see this as a very strongly aesthetic notion of the meaning of life. A meaningful life, for Nietzsche, is a successful creative act. It's a work of art. It's art on a grand performance scale from birth to death. We're now going to turn in our very next lecture to what I think is an even more radical critique of modernity. You might have thought that Nietzsche was as radical as it could get, and he is pretty radical. But we're now going to see a critique that integrates both pre-modern and postmodern ideas, one that's going to reach back to the Gita to offer a very stunning critique of modernity, and that one comes in the work of Mohandas Gandhi. Please stay with me for that lecture.